Picture the Tower of London, May 19, 1536. The air is heavy, as if the ancient stones themselves are holding their breath. A scaffold has been built upon the green, the crowd hushed but restless, eyes fixed upon the woman who walks toward her death with eerie calm. She is no ordinary prisoner. She is Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, once the most desired woman in the realm, now condemned as a traitor, an adulteress, even accused of incest with her own brother. She wears a simple gown of grey damask, her dark eyes shining not with fear, but with a strange serenity. Her hands, delicate and pale, clutch a small prayer book. A French swordsman waits nearby, his blade hidden beneath his cloak, summoned from Calais for this singular purpose. Henry VIII, once madly in love with her, has granted her this mercy, a swift death by sword, rather than the brutal axe. The crowd shifts uneasily. They had seen Anne rise like no woman before her, a lady-in-waiting who captured the king's heart so completely that he defied the Pope, broke with Rome, and plunged England into religious revolution just to make her his queen. She had been the flame that consumed a kingdom, and now she is to be extinguished. Anne mounts the scaffold. The wind tugs at her veil. Silence falls as she begins to speak, her voice clear, ringing across the courtyard. I have come here to die. I do not accuse the king, my sovereign, nor my husband. May God save him, for he is a good and gentle prince. Her words are a mixture of dignity and tragedy, loyalty and betrayal. She bows her head, kneels upon the straw. The crowd holds its breath. The sword flashes in the morning light. And with a single stroke, Anne Boleyn's life ends. But her story does not. For Anne's death was not merely the fall of a queen, it was the climax of a tale of passion, ambition, betrayal, and blood. The tale of how a woman of intelligence and fire rose from obscurity to the throne of England, reshaped the fate of a kingdom, and paid the ultimate price. Anne Boleyn's journey is not just history. It is a drama as gripping as any ever told, the story of a love that defied the Pope, a crown won and lost, and a woman who died with her eyes wide open, knowing she would never be forgotten. To understand Anne Boleyn's dazzling rise and tragic fall, we must return decades before the sword fell at the Tower of London, back to her earliest years, when she was still just another daughter in an ambitious but not extraordinary English family. Anne was born around 1501, though her exact birth date remains uncertain, a fitting mystery for a woman whose life would be cloaked in rumor. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was an able courtier, skilled in diplomacy and languages. Her mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, came from the powerful Howard family, one of England's most aristocratic bloodlines. This combination placed Anne within reach of the highest circles of power, but not at their center. She was not born to be a queen. She was born to be useful. From the start, Anne's life was shaped by ambition, not her own, but her family's. The Boleyns understood the game of court politics, where daughters were valuable pawns to be placed in the households of queens and princesses, where they might catch the eye of kings or forge ties that could elevate the entire clan. Anne's elder sister, Mary Boleyn, would later become Henry VIII's mistress for a time. But Anne's path was different, sharper, more dangerous. As a child, Anne was not noted for striking beauty. Contemporary descriptions paint her as dark-haired, with eyes, black and beautiful, and a lively wit that drew men more surely than mere looks. She had a long neck, an olive complexion unusual in England, and a charisma that could transform her from plain to unforgettable in an instant. Her charm was not passive, it was active, intelligent, almost electric. Those who spoke with her often left dazzled, even unsettled. Her education was extraordinary for a girl of her time. Around the age of 12, Anne was sent across the Channel, first to the Netherlands, then to the glittering French court of Queen Claude of France. It was there, in the heart of Renaissance Europe, that she was truly formed. France was a world of elegance and danger, of poetry and intrigue, of women who wielded power from behind veils and whispered words. Anne learned French fluently, studied music, dance, and the art of conversation. More importantly, she absorbed the sophistication and confidence of continental courts, far more refined than the stiff rituals of England. She watched queens and mistresses, duchesses and courtesans, and she learned. It was in France that Anne developed what contemporaries called her allure, that intangible mixture of wit, confidence, and subtle sensuality that would later captivate Henry VIII. She was not the most beautiful woman in a room, but she was always the most magnetic. She could flirt without lowering her dignity, argue without losing her charm, tease without overstepping the line. She became, in short, a master of presence. When Anne returned to England around 1521, she was no longer a provincial girl. She was French in manner, European in outlook, and utterly unlike the English ladies at court. Where they were demure, she was dazzling. Where they obeyed, she questioned. Where they conformed, she stood apart. It did not take long for men to notice. Among them was Henry, Percy, heir to the powerful Earl of Northumberland. Percy fell in love with Anne, and for a brief moment it seemed she might become his wife. But Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, chief minister of Henry VIII, crushed the match. Anne was simply too politically useful to be married off without calculation. Percy was forced to wed another, and Anne, humiliated and furious, learned a hard lesson. Her heart was not her own. Love was subordinate to power. This rejection might have broken a lesser woman. For Anne, it sharpened her resolve. If she could not choose freely, she would at least choose powerfully. Meanwhile, Anne's sister Mary Boleyn was already entangled with Henry VIII, likely as his mistress. But where Mary gave herself easily, Anne held back. She knew her worth, and she knew the king's weakness. Henry was impulsive, vain, and accustomed to women who surrendered to him. Anne did not. She set her own terms. Her refusal was her weapon. When Henry pursued her, she rejected him, not rudely, but firmly, insisting she would not be his mistress. If he wanted her, it must be as his wife. Such defiance inflamed Henry's desire. No woman had ever dared to resist him. Anne's gamble was audacious, even reckless. But it worked. By the mid-1520s, Anne had become the center of the king's obsession. Her intelligence, her style, her very presence lit a fire in him. He wrote her passionate letters, pledging his undying love, calling her his darling, his entirely beloved. Yet still she resisted. Each refusal deepened his hunger. In Anne's transformation, we see the seeds of both her glory and her doom. She was no ordinary court beauty. She was a woman forged in the crucible of ambition, sharpened by rejection, and emboldened by the intoxicating atmosphere of Renaissance courts. Her childhood and youth prepared her not just to survive in a world of kings, but to bend it, for a time, to her will. The girl who left England as an obscure courtier's daughter had returned as a woman who could challenge a king. And she would. For Anne Boleyn was not destined merely to capture Henry VIII's heart. She was destined to ignite a revolution that would tear England away from Rome, crown her as queen, and eventually drag her to a scaffold. Her rise was just beginning. When Anne Boleyn returned from France, she was more than just another lady in waiting. She carried with her the sophistication of the Renaissance, the wit of Parisian salons, and the boldness of one who had seen queens and courtesans wield power like daggers. England had never seen a woman quite like her. At first, she served as lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Catherine was Spanish, dignified, pious, a woman admired for her devotion but wearied by years of failed pregnancies. Outwardly, her marriage to Henry VIII was stable. Inwardly, it was crumbling. Catherine had given Henry one surviving child, Princess Mary, but no son. And to Henry, obsessed with his legacy, that failure was fatal. It was in this vacuum of frustration that Anne emerged, not as a simple distraction, but as a revelation. Henry had taken mistresses before, many of them fleeting affairs, including Anne's own sister, Mary. But Anne was different. She resisted. She would not yield to the king's advances. When Henry courted her with gifts, she returned them. When he flattered her with letters, she left him unanswered for weeks. In an age when kings were accustomed to instant obedience, Anne's refusals were intoxicating. The very act of saying no made her irresistible. Henry became infatuated. He wrote Anne letters dripping with passion, promising he would make her mistress of his body and his heart. He signed them with symbols of fidelity, like a lovesick boy rather than the most powerful man in England. Anne, skilled in the game, walked the razor's edge, enough warmth to keep him desperate, enough distance to keep him chasing. Soon, all of court London whispered about her. Was she a temptress, a witch even, who had bewitched the king? Or was she a woman of rare intelligence, holding out not for lust but for the crown itself? Anne herself was no fool. She knew what surrender would mean. To become Henry's mistress would elevate her briefly, then discard her like all the others. But to hold out for marriage? That was unthinkable. Henry was already wed, and his queen was still alive. Yet Anne staked everything on that gamble. Henry VIII's frustration with Catherine of Aragon had simmered for years. But now, with Anne at the center of his obsession, frustration turned to fury. He convinced himself that his lack of a male heir was divine punishment, that his marriage to Catherine, who had once been his brother's widow, was cursed in God's eyes. Anne became the spark to ignite his resolve. The king who once styled himself defender of the faith against Martin Luther now dared to challenge the Pope himself. He demanded an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. Rome refused. Catherine, proud and defiant, refused to step aside. The Pope, pressured by Catherine's nephew, the powerful Emperor Charles V, denied Henry at every turn. And so Henry broke with Rome. What began as passion for a woman became a schism that changed the world. Between 1527 and 1533, Henry pushed England into uncharted territory, rejecting papal authority, declaring himself head of the Church of England. The monasteries trembled. Priests muttered against the sacrilege. Europe gasped as England, long loyal to Rome, tore itself free. And at the center of it all was Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom a king had defied the Pope. In 1532, Henry named Anne Marquess of Pembroke, a title in her own right, an unprecedented honor for a woman not yet queen. By then, Anne was pregnant. Henry could wait no longer. In January 1533, they were secretly married. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The coronation was both triumph and scandal. Crowds lined the streets of London, some cheering, many jeering. To her enemies, Anne was nothing but a usurper, the concubine queen, who had stolen Catherine's place. Yet to Henry, she was radiant. He had risked everything for her, and he expected her to give him the son he craved. In September 1533, Anne gave birth. The court held its breath. Henry's eyes burned with anticipation. When the child emerged, it was a girl, Elizabeth. For Henry, it was a bitter disappointment. For Anne, it was a dangerous crack in her armor. Still, the child would one day prove greater than either of them could imagine. Elizabeth I would become England's most iconic queen, but in that moment, she was simply a failure in Henry's eyes. Anne's position remained strong for a time. She had influence, she had the king's love, and she had her sharp mind. She surrounded herself with reformist scholars, promoting Protestant ideas and patronizing the arts. She was more than a queen. She was a symbol of a new England, free from Rome, guided by ambition and intellect rather than tradition. But love is fickle. Henry was a man of shifting passions, and the same fire that made him burn for Anne could just as easily turn to ashes. When her next pregnancies ended in miscarriage and stillbirth, whispers began to grow louder. Was Anne cursed? Was God punishing Henry again? Was this queen truly chosen, or had she bewitched the king into damnation? Anne had risen higher than any woman before her. She had bent a king to her will, toppled a queen, and changed the course of English history. But the higher one climbs, the harder one falls. And for Anne Boleyn, the fall was already beginning. Queens are made to be adored, to shine like the sun. But for Anne Boleyn, the sun that had lifted her so high now began to scorch her. What had once been passion was curdling into suspicion, disappointment, and ultimately betrayal. The first cracks appeared not in politics, but in the cradle. Henry VIII, obsessed with having a son to secure his dynasty, watched each of Anne's pregnancies with mounting anxiety. Elizabeth's birth in 1533 had already left him bitter. He loved the child, yes, but she was not the heir he had demanded. Still, Anne was young. There would be more chances. Yet each new hope turned into heartbreak. In 1534, Anne miscarried. Then again in 1535. Each time, whispers spread through the court. Some said it was witchcraft. Others whispered God's wrath, punishing the king for abandoning Catherine of Aragon. By 1536, when Anne lost another child, a boy, tragically stillborn, Henry's patience snapped. The king who had once written her letters of burning devotion now avoided her chambers. His eyes roamed elsewhere. His heart, once hers alone, began to harden. Anne's temper did not help her cause. She was brilliant, but she was also sharp-tongued, proud, and quick to anger. She sparred with Henry, accused him of infidelity, and mocked his vanity. No queen in English history had ever dared speak so boldly to her husband, least of all one as mercurial as Henry VIII. For years, her defiance had intoxicated him. Now it infuriated him. And in the shadows, enemies circled. Anne had never been popular. To Catherine's supporters, she was a usurper. To the common people, she was the concubine queen. To traditionalists, she was the woman who had dragged England into schism with Rome. At court, she had alienated allies with her fiery temper and uncompromising manner. Even her ally, Thomas Cromwell, began to turn against her. Cromwell had once worked with Anne to push religious reform, dismantling monasteries and seizing wealth for the crown. But as Anne pressed for that money to go toward education and charity, Cromwell wanted it for royal coffers and his own power. Their conflict became deadly. Cromwell understood Henry's moods better than anyone. He knew the king was restless, desperate for a male heir, and increasingly enchanted by another woman, Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. The trap was set. In early 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. For Anne, this should have been triumph, her rival removed, her daughter Elizabeth secured as the king's sole heir. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. For with Catherine gone, Henry no longer needed Anne's legitimacy. He was free to cast her aside. Cromwell whispered poison into the king's ear. He spoke of treason, of betrayal. He accused Anne of what no queen had ever been charged with before, adultery. Worse, incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were grotesque, unsupported by evidence, but Henry's mind, inflamed by disappointment and rage, was ready to believe. The arrests began in May 1536. Musicians, courtiers, even a poet, men Anne was accused of seducing, were dragged to the Tower. Her brother George was taken too. Finally, the Queen herself was arrested. One day she was dining in splendor, the next, she was a prisoner, locked behind cold stone walls. The trial was a spectacle. Anne, once the dazzling star of England, now stood accused before a hostile court. The charges were read: treason, adultery, incest. The evidence was laughably thin. Dates and places did not match, witnesses contradicted themselves. Yet the verdict had been written long before the trial began. Henry wanted her gone, Cromwell wanted her destroyed, and the peers of England, many of whom she had insulted in her rise, were eager to watch her fall. Anne defended herself with eloquence and courage. She denied every charge, lifting her head high, her dark eyes flashing with indignation. But courage could not save her. The court declared her guilty. The sentence was death. In her cell, Anne's composure amazed even her guards. She prayed, she sang hymns, she comforted those around her. But she also knew the truth. Her fate was sealed not by justice, but by the king's shifting desire. Henry VIII, who had torn a kingdom apart to possess her, now demanded her death. The most bitter irony? The French swordsman who would kill her was brought as an act of mercy. An executioner with a blade, swift and clean, instead of the English axeman whose clumsy blows often required several strikes. A cold comfort, but comfort nonetheless. And so Anne waited, knowing that the man she had once loved, perhaps even loved still, had signed her death warrant. The dark side of her triumph had come full circle. The passion that had raised her to a throne now condemned her to the scaffold. The woman who had reshaped England through fire and desire was about to pay with her blood. The spring of 1536 was a season of dread in London. Whispers filled the taverns, churches, and marketplaces. The Queen herself, Anne Boleyn, had been arrested. She, who had once been the very sun of the king's passion, was now painted as a serpent, a witch, a traitor who had betrayed her husband and her crown. The fall was dizzying, breathtaking, almost unimaginable. When Anne was taken to the Tower of London, she entered through the Traitor's Gate, the same cold archway through which many condemned souls had passed, never to return. The irony was cruel. She had once entered the Tower as a queen, for her coronation in 1533, cheered by crowds. Now, 3 years later, she entered as a prisoner, her fate sealed by the man she had once conquered. The trial was not justice. It was theater. Anne's supposed lovers, musicians, courtiers, even her own brother George, had already been condemned. Under torture or threat, they confessed to impossible crimes. One was accused of meeting her in Westminster when records proved he was in France. Another was accused of betting her on a date when she was pregnant and confined. Facts did not matter. The machinery of power was grinding her down. Anne stood before her judges in May 1536, dressed in black velvet, her dark eyes shining with indignation and pride. She denied every charge with fiery eloquence, her voice steady though her life hung in the balance. "If any man accuses me," she declared, "let him stand forth. But I say this: never have I been unfaithful to the king, nor traitor to my country." The court, packed with men who owed their loyalty to Henry VIII, listened with stony faces. The verdict was inevitable: guilty, death. Anne was returned to her cell in the Tower. There, in those final days, she revealed a composure that stunned even her jailers. She laughed, she prayed, she sang hymns. Some thought she had gone mad. But it was not madness, it was defiance. If she could not control her fate, she would control her manner of meeting it. Yet she was also human. In her solitude, she wrote letters, pleading for Elizabeth's future, praying that her daughter would not be branded by her mother's shame. She wondered aloud how a king who had once loved her, above all women, could now thirst so eagerly for her blood. Her ladies-in-waiting wept with her, and yet she consoled them. "Do not grieve," she whispered. "I am going to a better place." Meanwhile, Henry VIII celebrated. He dined in public, rode through London, openly courted Jane Seymour. It was as if Anne was already dead. For him, she was. May 19, 1536. The day dawned cool and bright. The scaffold was erected upon Tower Green, its timbers stark against the sky. A crowd gathered, hushed, straining to glimpse the queen who had changed the destiny of England. Anne emerged from the tower, escorted by guards, her gown of grey damask flowing around her slender frame. Her face was pale but serene, her dark eyes luminous. She carried a small prayer book in her hands. Those who saw her swore that never had she looked more queenly, even in her downfall. She mounted the scaffold with grace. Turning to the crowd, she spoke, her voice carrying clear and strong. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. I am by law condemned to death, and I will say nothing against it. I pray and beseech you all to pray for the king, for he is a good and gentle prince. And if any man will meddle of my cause, I require him to judge the best. Thus I take my leave of the world and of you all." Not a word of bitterness. No accusation, only prayer for the husband who had condemned her. Some wept, others stood in stunned silence. The executioner, a Frenchman skilled with the sword, stepped forward. Anne knelt upon the straw, removed her headdress, and tucked her hair beneath a linen cap. She whispered a final prayer: "O Lord, into thy hands I commend my soul." The executioner, by tradition, called for his assistant to fetch the sword, causing Anne to turn her head slightly. In that instant, he swung. The blade flashed, clean and swift. With one stroke, Anne Boleyn's life ended. The crowd gasped. Some crossed themselves, others turned away. A stunned silence hung over Tower Green, broken only by the cry of birds above. The woman who had defied a king, who had sparked a reformation, who had risen higher than any before her, now lay lifeless upon the straw. Her body was hastily placed in an arrow chest and buried within the tower's chapel. No grand tomb, no royal rites, only anonymity and silence. Yet in that silence, a legend was born. For Anne's death was not just the end of a queen. It was the climax of one of the most extraordinary dramas in English history, a story of passion that defied the Pope, ambition that shook a kingdom, betrayal that destroyed a queen, and a legacy that would outlast them all. And though her enemies sought to erase her, they could not. For her daughter, Elizabeth, would one day ascend the throne and rule as one of the greatest monarchs England had ever known. Anne Boleyn had lost her life. But in losing it, she gave England a future it could not yet imagine. Anne Boleyn's body may have been hurried into an unmarked grave within the tower, but her shadow stretched far beyond those cold stones. Her enemies had sought to erase her, a queen condemned, a woman branded adulteress, traitor, witch. Yet history does not forget so easily. Her greatest legacy was not in her life, but in the life she gave. Elizabeth Tudor, her daughter, dismissed at birth as a disappointment, grew to become Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, a monarch who ruled England for 45 years. Under Elizabeth, England entered a golden age of art, exploration, and power, standing proud among the nations of Europe. In her daughter's reign, Anne's bloodline redeemed itself, and the girl born in the shadow of scandal became a symbol of England's destiny. But Anne's legacy is not only Elizabeth. It is the transformation she triggered. Her rise and fall forced Henry VIII to sever England from Rome, forever altering the course of religion and politics. Without Anne, there may have been no English Reformation, no Church of England, no Elizabethan Golden Age. She was the match that lit the fire, the spark that set a kingdom ablaze. Through centuries, Anne has been many things to many people. To her detractors, she was an ambitious schemer who used seduction to climb to the throne. To her admirers, she was a woman ahead of her time, educated, intelligent, unwilling to be merely a man's possession. To storytellers, she became a tragic heroine, a figure of passion and betrayal whose fall still fascinates the world. And perhaps that is Anne Boleyn's true immortality, that she defies simple judgment. She was neither saint nor villain, but something greater, human. A woman who dared to want more, who dared to defy convention, who dared to risk everything for love and for power. Her enemies silenced her voice with a blade. But her story? Her story still speaks. It whispers from the stones of the tower, from the pages of chronicles, from the echoes of Elizabeth's triumph. It tells us that even in downfall, even in death, a woman can shape history. Anne Boleyn died with dignity, her eyes open to the cruelty of her fate. Yet in that moment, unknowingly, she opened the door to a new England. And so, nearly 5 centuries later, we still remember her. Not just as a queen who lost her head, but as a woman who changed the world.